Welcome.
Thank you very much. I am very conscious of the fact that I'm the only thing between you and a cup of coffee, so I will try and make this presentation as relevant and as focused as possible. I do apologise in advance, it is very UK-centric. What I'm going to cover today are a number of areas. I'm going to touch very quickly on future energy demands. I'm going to talk about the current UK market arrangements for the transfer of data, how those arrangements are being stressed and evolved to cope with the deployment of smart metering, and also a very UK-specific issue, which I'll touch on if I have time, which is the importance of interoperability. So, future energy demands. My fellow co-speakers have spoken a lot about embedded generation, renewables, so I'm not going to focus on that. I'm just going to explain how the UK market has evolved. So, pre-1990, big focus on security of supply. Post-1990, progressive deregulation, competition introduced where you can have competition, which is retail supply and generation, regulated private monopolies created where there are natural monopolies, namely transmission and distribution. However, we're now reaching another turning point in the market's development with the focus on decarbonisation, and the UK government, and this particular initiative achieves fairly broad cross-party support, has signed up to some very aggressive carbon reduction targets, in particular the plan to use 40% or to have 40% of generation coming from low carbon sources by 2020. So a real challenge for the industry to try and deliver against these government targets. So, current UK market arrangements. The key thing about the UK market, and I'm conscious that you might not all be familiar with the arrangements that we have, is there is a clear separation between supply and distribution. So when we talk about smart metering, we talk about smart grids, that clearly does create a fairly major challenge as to how those two elements of the industry coordinate between each other. Two big transactions this year. Two of the suppliers disposed of their distribution business, and so that separation, I'm pretty sure that's the latest picture, but that separation now has become even more apparent than it was 12 months ago. The other complexity of the UK market is that there are a large number of participants. The UK market is defined by industry roles. There are over 30 roles. I have selected at random 12 roles there for you. I'm not going to go through each one, but you have competition in meter asset provision, you have competition in meter operation, you have data collectors, data aggregators, data retrievers. Very, very complex market. All of those industry participants are linked together by very complex industry processes, which are all written down and are subject to industry change control. And the data that transfers between the parties to make those industry processes work, if I can get this animation to work, is over a single communications infrastructure to which all the electricity market, or the retail electricity in the market in the UK connects. And that single, with this very clever animation here, that single network is called the Data Transfer Network, the DTN. And the DTN is what my company procures and manages on behalf of the electricity industry in the UK. So we were founded in 1997. We are owned by the distribution companies. So we're on the right-hand side of that chart. We fulfill a license obligation on behalf of the distribution companies, and we adopt a procure and manage model. So we procure these services on behalf of the industry. We drive down cost. We manage SLAs. And we encourage innovation. We also have a fairly large commercial side. In addition to our regulated business, we have a large commercial side, and we have a growing governance services business, which helps manage some of that industry complexity that I alluded to earlier. So what is the data transfer network? I do have a telecoms background, but I'm not going to go into this in a great deal of detail. It's essentially a managed network that we procure and manage on behalf of the electricity industry. Everybody in the electricity industry has either a gateway, which is a physical device that sits in their premise, or they remotely access our network. They place data files in the gateway, and we ensure that we deliver those files securely in a way that is auditable, and we have been doing that, as I said, fairly successfully since the late 1990s. Security is obviously a big issue. Also, disaster recovery is a big issue. We run dual hubs. We have hot standby. Both of them are located in Tier 1 data centers. We provide help desks. We manage SLAs, and we provide reporting back to our users. So the key deliverables for us are maintaining security, number one. Number two, driving down cost. And also, because we are a regulated business and essentially a monopoly, to ensure market efficiency, in particular, allow new entry into the market. So, data security, as I said earlier, we operate a managed service. So in other words, as soon as the data is transferred onto our network, we ensure its secure delivery to the recipient. We use PKI infrastructure, and we expect to be ISO 27001 certified by the end of this year. And touch wood, in the lifetime of the DTN, have not had a single security incident. Cost effective, I think this chart speaks for itself. We've had an increase in volume, as you would expect, over the years. We've driven SLA performance up to a consistent performance of 100%. And those cost bars you see, that is a cost of the industry network expressed in pence per meter, per MPAN, which is meter point, per year. So we cost the industry 15 pence, which is roughly 20 euro cents per meter per year. So, new data collection requirements. How is this arrangement that I've very quickly taken you through going to evolve going forward? Well, clearly the biggest driver to evolution is the deployment of smart meters. This is the current timetable for deploying smart meters in the UK. I'm not going to take you through each and every stage there, but there are some key dates. The first is the European Union tech spec approval for the meter. As you will see, during 2012 and 2013, there are increasing obligations on suppliers to roll out meters, culminating in the formation of what's called the DCC, which is what I'll explain later, the beginning of 2014, and then mass deployments starting in 2014. And interestingly, from this morning's presentation, it sounds like that's a similar schedule to that exists in the Netherlands. So what is the DCC? Well, you've seen the complexity of the UK market. The decision taken by Ofgem and DEC, Ofgem is the energy regulator in the UK, was to have a single comms infrastructure for smart metering in the UK, which will be shared by all of the suppliers. And the reason for doing that was primarily to aid in supplier switching. Having duplicate communications network would make that very difficult. So that decision was taken a while back, and the procurement for the DCC has now started. So what the DCC, the Data Communications Company, will do is it will run access control, translation and data retrieval on behalf of the industry, and it will do so using a comms network which is currently in the process of being procured. It might be GPRS, it might be Powerline. That's subject to a competitive procurement. Clearly, from our perspective as the operators of the DTN, we need to understand how the users of smart meters want to access their assets. And there are a number of users. If you look on the right-hand side of that chart, it's not just the suppliers who are responsible for deploying smart meters in the UK, or will be responsible for deploying smart meters. It's also their agents, it's also the DNOs or the distributors, and it's also this new market participant called energy service companies. And these are the organisations which Ofgem and DEC view as being the real drivers of innovation. And by giving them access to the meter, the idea is that they will be able to provide services to achieve some of those low carbon goals that I mentioned earlier. So what we've done is, as you would expect in a process of industry change, is to go out to our users and understand how they want to interact with the DCC. And I wanted to share with you in the next slide what the feedback from that stakeholder consultation was. So the first, which was quite interesting, was there is a range of communication methods which the participants in the market want to use to communicate with the DCC. Those range from what we describe as scheduled communications. Those would be meter reads. We then move up in terms of latency to near real-time data exchange with the DCC, and that's an example of that will be alerts. And then you have online access to the meter, and a good example of that is supplier uploading credit to a prepayment meter. In the UK, we have a combination of prepayment and credit meters. The other key piece of feedback from our stakeholder work was that they do require some of the value-added features that they currently receive on the DTN. Value add that our network provides, translations, acknowledgement, encryption, authentication, all of these the industry currently uses, and they would like to see replicated in the way that they interact with the DCC. And finally, when we tried to summarise what the feedback was from our consultation, when we went to consultation, we didn't just go to the big 6 suppliers. Obviously, we went to the small suppliers. We also went to the DNOs. Also went to some of the ESCOs too. And there were a number of themes that came out. The first was that any interaction with the DCC had to be cost effective, it had to be secure, it had to reuse existing infrastructure rather than try and reinvent. And I guess the most challenging requirement is it has to integrate electricity and gas. And the UK market does have 2 completely separate arrangements currently for electricity and gas, and yet we are deploying, or we're about to deploy in volume, dual fuel meters. So if you're going to access the DCC, clearly you can't access it as a gas participant and access it in a different way as an electricity market participant. There has to be a merge and a combination of the roles. So what does that mean for us? Well, the first thing is that we're clearly moving away from batch processes based on daily schedules. So the way the market currently works is, it's day to day. Company A puts files on the DTN, Company B processes those overnight, pass them to Company C. It's a very long-winded process, which in 1998 was probably the right thing to do, but clearly in 2011 needs to speed up a bit. The smart world is really driving the requirement for real-time data transfer. You've got connect, disconnect, alert management, prepaid top-ups. There's a number of functionalities of smart metering that does require real time. As you saw earlier, the network that we operate is an MPLS network. Those of you who know anything about data networking technology, that's a state-of-the-art data network. We're now enabling class of service on that network to allow batch processes, these non-real-time processes, to work over the same infrastructure and in parallel to some of these new real-time services. And the way class of service works is it basically allows those 2 classes of traffic to be carried on the same infrastructure without impacting each other. So that's movement to real time. What's a more interesting one for us is historically, as the data transfer agent, if you like, for the UK electricity market, is we transferred data and then we threw it away. We've never historically captured that data, aggregated it, and then analysed it. And what we're seeing now, as the industry is going through this contemplating this radical transformation, is that there is an increasing demand on us to start analysing that data. In particular, to look to see how certain market processes are working or not working, to see how particular participants in those processes benchmark against their competitors, and also to improve general data quality. I think there's a recognition that the data quality is not great, and if it's not sorted out, then the problems will become magnified as you move into the smart world. Clearly, any kind of data aggregation analysis, you have to be very careful in terms of the relevant data protection legislation, which is what you would expect us to do. But we did capture as a proof of concept 3 months' worth of UK market data, which translates to 1.3 billion data items. And we've run a series of workshops with suppliers looking at that data to see what's going on. And the one process that we started to look at, which wouldn't surprise you, was the change of supplier registration process. So this is the change of supplier registration process in the UK. I have no intention of taking you through it, but it involves around 10 separate data flows between a number of different market participants. Needless to say, it's not very quick, and it has a lot of exceptions to it. And at the moment, no one has an overview as to how that process is working or not working. Each of the individual participants can see how their bit is doing, but we can't see the overall process. So by capturing the market data, we've been able to analyse it, working with suppliers and working with distributors to see where it's going wrong. And we've been able to uncover some fascinating insights which the suppliers want us to carry on doing some more work on. Another way that you can use the data is you can overlay it onto a geographic representation. So this is cross-referencing the data, so the MPAN data, which gives you an indication as to where the address of the market process that we're looking at relates to geographic data, and you can overlay that on a map. This is just an example. It shows the time between SSD, which is supplier start date, and meter replacement. So it shows you how quickly suppliers change a meter, if in fact that's what they want to do when they receive a supplier. You can run various different types of analysis using this capability. So we're currently in the process of getting data services approved by our user group, and we will launch them in Q1 next year, and hopefully they will support the industry as it tries to reduce cost and speed up the deployment of smart meters. So I'm going to finish going a bit quickly on interoperability. You kind of wonder why I'm talking about interoperability, but this, from a data transfer perspective, is a big issue at the moment, and I'm going to explain to you ways in which Electrolink is helping solve this problem. So why have we got a problem with interoperability? The reason we've got a problem with interoperability is to meet the 2020 deadline for smart meter deployment is you have to roll out smart meters in volume before the DCC goes live. So we have what's called a foundation period between now and Q1 2014, assuming that the DCC procurement proceeds on schedule. And these are DEX numbers, or the UK government's numbers, not mine, that suggest that we could have anything between 2.7 and 6.5 million smart meters on the wall prior to a common communications infrastructure being up and running. Now, UK market churns at about 10 to 20% per year. So you can see from a customer experience, if you're rolling out 6.5 million meters and 15% of those are churning every year, you've just spent a lot of time and effort having a smart meter installed, you select a new supplier, suddenly it's not smart anymore. Or for example, you have a prepayment meter, you change supplier, the new supplier can't support prepayment on your meter. So from a customer experience perspective, it could be quite disastrous. So somehow, prior to the DCC, we've got to get interoperability between meters. So changes, there's various ways that you can do this, and I'll just run you through a couple of options which are being considered. So what we have here is we have a supplier, could be a managed service provider with a head end and a smart meter. Now, for whatever reason, that supplier's customer decides they don't like that supplier anymore, and they move to a gaining supplier, what we call a gaining supplier. So there's two scenarios. In the first scenario, the existing or the installing supplier will continue to support that meter and will transfer the relevant data to the gaining supplier. Now clearly there are various flows of information that will need to happen to facilitate that, and we are working both with DEC and with the industry to define what those are. We get this concept of an operating supplier, and then we, as I said, we have the gaining supplier, and the gaining supplier, for example, if you look in the prepayment case, would be responsible for achieving payment from the customer. They would then need to pass that information back to the operating supplier that would then need to update the meter. So you can see quite a lot of complexity already. But there's also another scenario as well, which is instead of having an operating supplier and a gaining supplier model, you could also have a head-end to head-end shift. So in this situation, the gaining supplier is able to transfer or to novate the comms contract from the losing supplier onto its own head end. You still need a transfer of meter technical details, MTD, but in this case, the comms link will actually shift across to the head end. Technically much more complicated. Don't think the standards are yet agreed or yet are mature enough to allow that to happen in all cases. But again, there's still a need for industry participants to be transferring data between each other to allow interoperability to happen. So that's just the first complexity. Then you've got a situation of having deployed up to 6.5 million meters. How do you migrate those 6.5 million meters into the DCC? So you've got here, I've called them supplier A, B and C. The DCC becomes operational. Its first challenge is to create a meter agnostic head end to support those meters. And you can see it will involve the introduction of translation services, which will allow things like access control, security, prepayment and scheduled reads. That's the first challenge. You then got to set up a mechanism for receiving novated comms contracts from the 6.5 million meters potentially that are out there. And then you've got to start migrating the meters across into your smart meter portfolio. The next challenge is to define new interface standards. As I say, as this migration carries on, you might want to start interfacing with the old suppliers using XML, for example. There's talk about using DLMS. These are still conversations which are ongoing. And then you've got the final migration and centralization when the DCC will eventually have moved all of these meters across. As you can see, it's not an insignificant challenge that the UK market has got to be able to roll out meters in foundation, to make those meters interoperable, and then to migrate them across to a centralized infrastructure as and when it's procured. Sorry, there's one final stage as well which I've missed out. 2017 registration is also moving across the DCC. So all this migration is going on while you're also about to receive registration. Registration in the UK is currently undertaken by the distribution companies, but it will migrate into the DCC. So in summary, the UK is a very complex market which is supported by a central data transfer infrastructure, which hopefully I've been able to demonstrate to you is cost effective and secure. SMART is creating the requirement for additional central infrastructure, in this case the DCC, and is driving data transfer towards real time. There's an increasing demand for data services, which has been driven by primarily the ability to store vast quantities of data and undertake business analytics on it. This was a technical capability that when Electrolink was formed just didn't exist, and now does. Market's going through some fairly radical transformation, and there is a demand for these services. And finally, the deployment of smart meters in volume prior to the DCC does create significant interoperability and migration challenges. That's all I was going to say. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm happy to take questions and answers.
Okay, thank you. It was a very good story about UK market, example market for all countries regulated later. Are there any questions for Mr. Lacey? There is one.
Jan Höller from Ericsson. I have a question regarding the increasing interest in performing business intelligence on the data that you're collecting, and looking at the presentation, what we heard this morning around getting the consumer in the loop and attracting them by a wealth of applications and so on. Have you been looking into exposing, or is there any demand for exposing data in a secure and privacy controlled manner to third parties to actually leverage on this vast amounts of data?
Well, I think there's a number of different elements to that question. The first is the data I'm talking about is existing market data. So this is prior to smart meter rollout, and obviously smart meter rollout will create an entirely new set of data. Is it best for a central body to be creative and to try and analyse this data in an innovative way? I would say no. I think what we do is much more around process adherence, making sure that people are performing the processes as they should. I think the model in the UK is that the data should reside in the meter, and that the consumer should give access to that meter to energy supply companies to be innovative and to come up with these clever solutions. I don't honestly think that those types of solutions are best managed or dealt with centrally. I think all we do as a central body is to ensure that the market operates, and I think the key thing is to ensure that there are no barriers to entry, because one consequence, maybe an unintended consequence of data centralisation could be that you consolidate the position of the existing players and you don't allow new people to come to the market, which is definitely not the policy outcome that the UK government's seeking to achieve.
Thank you. Another question to the woman over there.
Lynn Henderson, RWEIT. You talked about the complexity we've got in the UK market with the gas and electricity being different. Do you see this being a move towards the gas flows and messaging moving on to the DTN rather than being independent, or is that a step too far at this stage?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't rule anything out. I think you have to. I would split that between the data flows that are required for Exaserve to do its job. Exaserve is the UK entity, central body that deals with the gas market, and then there is a separate requirement which is for gas market participants to access the DCC. So I think if you split those up, it makes sense for that second requirement to be handled by a single network, and that network could be IXNet, could be DTN. I think we've probably got more of an appetite for it than IXNet. How you then go on to look at the data transfer arrangements for the gas market, I don't think it's a step too far. I don't think it's a step that just hasn't been contemplated yet, but perhaps given the challenges that Exaserve has on redefining its business, it could be a conversation that we could have with them in some point in the future.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, then I have one. I have a lot, but stick to one. If I understand it good, the supplier installs the meter. Does he create a lock-in to the customer and so hinder the free market for new entrants?
Well, I think that plays to the whole point about interoperability. The idea is that the supplier has the best understanding of its own customer, which is why the supplier has been given the responsibility of deploying meters and not the distributors. I think it's up to the suppliers to ensure that their customer does not churn to a new supplier, and it's up to the industry and the arrangements the industry to put in place to ensure that if they do decide to change supplier, that there is no lock-in, that meter does interoperate. And I think the formation of the DCC and the solution of some of the issues that I was referring to there will ensure, or hopefully will ensure, that that happens.
Do I understand it well that the several walls in the UK market are separated, so a supplier can also be a meter access provider or whatever?
Yeah, so to give you an example, a supplier can install a meter in its customer's home. That meter can be funded by a completely separate entity called a meter asset provider. So a meter asset provider really doesn't care whether it's British Gas or Empire or anybody else, as long as they can invoice somebody for the rental of that meter. So if the meter did shift in that case, the industry processes are geared up to mean that the meter asset provider can keep track of that asset and then can invoice the new supplier with the use. So that's how the market works. Of course, in theory and on PowerPoint, it looks easy, but the devil is always in the detail, and there are issues with some of the industry processes, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you. Before we give him the desired applause, first I want to tell you we want to start at 4 o'clock sharp for the second of the last two presentations. And now we have a coffee break, so if it's possible, be on time. Thank you.